There we go.
This is cute.
It's not zoomed in on us, it's zoomed in on your computer.
Do you really want to zoom in on us, Debbie?
Oh, wait.
Yeah. So it was Federalist versus, like, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Party?
The Republican Party originally, let's stay with that name. Because, and that's why, the reason I'm mentioning that is, the two authors were reading to support the power of the local government or small government is Sentinel, the anti-federalist. But the second one is Jefferson. Now, Jefferson wasn't an anti-federalist. He was in France during the ratification struggle, and when he came back, what position did Washington appoint him to, Sandy? The only, we just studied this in Hamilton, yeah.
Secretary of State.
He was Secretary of State. And Hamilton and he became bitter enemies, and eventually Jefferson left Washington's cabinet because he intended to run for president, and he did, by the way, and he won in 1800. And you'll see that Jefferson shares with Sentinel the same embrace of this small, local, decentralized form of government. And then you'll see the two sides of the debate I'm going to frame. We're going to look at the other side. And guess who, among the founders, makes the strongest argument for a powerful, centralized national government? Who do you think? Alexander Hamilton, and we'll read Federalist 11. Now, you've read Federalist 10 in this class, so what paper does Federalist 11 come after?
Federalist 10.
Very good.
That felt like a trick question.
You know, it wasn't a trick question, but it's a true question. So again, today we'll look at the main arguments for a strong centralized national government from Hamilton and Federalist 11. That's the last thing we'll do today. And then we'll look at the argument for why centralized government is a bad idea and why it should remain small, local, and at least on the state level. That's Sentinel and Jefferson. Now, as you're going to see, as I mentioned when we turned to the Constitutional Convention, and if you look, by the way, I mentioned it briefly in the notes, if you look at Chapter 3, which is Wilson's chapter on federalism, which is, by the way, the same way that Chapter 2 was relevant to both the Declaration and the Founding and the Constitution, Chapter 3 is relevant to all three classes that we're doing on federalism. And we'll come back to that next Wednesday. But I just want to show you how I've laid this material out for you. So, by the way, it shouldn't surprise you that the Constitution wants to have both a strong national government and strong local state governments. In fact, do you remember when I said the three new things in the Constitution? If you've looked at Wilson's Chapter 3, I think it's on page 40, he has those three, and he has the three kinds of political systems. He calls, the first one is unitary, and that's a purely national system. You know what that means. In a purely national system of government, well, first of all, let me just preface it with this. All countries, even smaller countries like England, the only reason I say England's a smaller country is England is only about as large, I think, as New Jersey, I think.
You're lying.
I think
Like population-wise or like land area?
Land area.
Oh my God.
It's a relatively small country now. Like Germany is one of the largest European countries, it's about as large as Oregon. And France is about as large as Virginia. So the whole European subcontinent is only about 1/3 of the territory of the United States. But at any rate, all political systems have both centralized national power and local governments. It just seems as if even in a small country, in one of the smallest countries, actually I know somebody from one of the smallest countries in the world. One of my friends in the Jewish community in Charlotte is from Liechtenstein. You ever heard of Liechtenstein?
Yes.
Have you?
She's one.
No, I've heard of it.
Really?
Where is it?
Isn't it in Germany?
No, it's an independent country.
Oh.
It
I
borders
know it's
Germany, Switzerland, and France.
Okay, well I was close.
Well, it's like saying
Partial-
France
partial
also
doesn't
borders
know
Germany,
what
but Liechtenstein is about 8 miles wide.
Okay, I thought it was a city.
No,
Sorry.
well, it has about 30,000 people. It has a capital, but it's actually not much larger than Spartanburg. Yeah, question.
Can you go back? You were naming three things that was government right before you got on.
Wilson talks about the three kinds of political systems in his chapter. A unitary or national system, that's where all sovereignty is in the national center. Now, in other words, if you look at France or England, they have local governments, But the local governments in those countries have no independent power outside the national government. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
They have provinces, but the provinces are little creations of and created by the national government. By the way, our states are like that. Like, we have counties, right? But who creates the counties? Where do counties come from?
Don't
And
they
cities, for that matter. Who controls counties and cities in our
State?
The state government does. In other words, literally, the county of Spartanburg, which, by the way, I think it was at the beginning of the 1900s, Cherokee and Spartanburg County were separated from each other. They were actually one county. I think it was all Spartanburg County, and then they were separated into those two counties. But my point here is this: the state government creates the counties, they can abolish them, and the counties have no power to resist the state government. Does that make sense? So in other words, our states are like what Wilson calls a unitary system. England has municipalities and counties too, but the national government in England completely controls them, and the same in France. To go to the other side of the spectrum, what kind of government is it when independent and sovereign states become members of a union and don't yield up their sovereignty? What kind of system is that called? You might have read chapter 3 already, but what was the name of our first system of government?
Wait, what?
What was the name of our first system of government in this country?
I feel like this is a trick question.
It's not a trick question. What did the Constitution replace?
They did that article.
The Articles of?
Confederation.
So what was the name of our first system of government?
Confederation.
The Articles of?
Confederation.
Because what kind of system was it? A
Confederation.
She
confederation.
just said that.
Good, you're so far away, Sabrina, I couldn't hear you.
My brain.
So what's a confederation?
The first American government.
What, have you read Wilson chapter 3?
Is that a
That's
confederation?
our textbook, right?
That's one of them.
Okay, because I have that, but I just didn't realize we were supposed to be reading. So. I'm slow if you haven't figured this out by now. I don't think I was meant to be in your classes.
Page 40,
Mhm.
the three systems: unitary, confederal or confederation, and federal. If you remember, I said one of the novel features of the Constitution was a new kind of federalism. And what that means is, and that's what Wilson calls the second system, which is what our present system is. In other words, what's the difference between England and us? We both have national governments.
Theirs is a monarchy.
Well, theirs is a monarchy, but even France, which doesn't have a monarchy, is a unitary or national system.
It's the fact that our federal government doesn't really have like much hold over what our state government tells our cities and stuff like that.
Well, you'll see that
compared to when-
that's the question. Because in our system, the difference is that we have states, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, is it because
You remember when we talked about the preamble, when we discussed the Constitution last week? And I said that the preamble just doesn't create a more perfect union, it creates a different kind of union.
Mhm.
How did the basis of the union change from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution?
It changed because like when Maryland joined or like Virginia joined ratified the Constitution. When they ratified it, it was like under the people of Maryland, but when Virginia ratified it, it was the people of Virginia and Maryland, and it created.
So what's the basis of the union under the Constitution?
The people.
Right, because what's the first line in the preamble?
We the people.
Not we the states, but we the people. And again, it's confusing because the name of the country remained the same, the United States of America. So does that, but here's the point. It's true, the Constitution creates a new union based on the union of the American people. It's a nation, it's a national government. And the powers of the national government are just like the powers of the national government anywhere in the world. But the difference is this: did the Constitution abolish or destroy the states? They're still there, right? And the problem is the states didn't give up all of their sovereignty. It's true. They still kept some of their sovereignty. Now, and here's what this second alternative is, what Wilson calls. The problem in our system is we say that both the national government is sovereign, meaning it has some final authority over certain things. And you understand, the states in our system are not provinces of the national government. They are semi-sovereign entities, like semi-independent countries. And that means we have a problem in our system that national or unitary governments don't, or confederations don't. In the confederation, all the power remains with the state governments, right? They remain sovereign, like the nations in the United Nations. Is that clear? Again, do you understand, if we got tired of being in the United Nations as a country, an independent sovereign country, what could we easily do?
Withdraw.
Yeah, just withdraw. Of course, we destroy the United Nations since we supply about 1/4 of its budget. That's the scandal of the United Nations. If it weren't for the United States, the United Nations would completely collapse. But at any rate, but that's in our states. So here's the irony or the complexity. Are the states in our system simply independent countries?
One more time.
Are the states in our system today independent sovereign states?
No, they're
No.
semi-sovereign.
So, but listen to the problem. We try to do something that, again, this is one of the novel features. We try to divide sovereignty so that there's the sovereignty that belongs to the national government and the sovereignty that belongs to the states. That means in our system, and that's why this is so complicated, the issue, and that's why Wilson says that, if I might walk you through my introductory stuff, when I say it's a honor, I can assure you you've been fascinated by this discussion so far. But Wilson makes the argument that this question, where to find the dividing line between the states and the nation in terms of authority and issues, is actually the longest standing set of tensions. You're going to see that to some degree, what I just mentioned earlier, the tension between the Federalists and the Republicans, the first party. The first great political tension was between those that wanted to strengthen the states and those that wanted to strengthen the national government. The Civil War. You understand the Civil War was the bloodiest and most horrific conflict in our history. How would you measure that?
Wait.
Just look at the death toll. How many people did the Civil War kill? How many soldiers did it kill? I think I gave you this.
Many, a lot.
I don't know.
By the way, I want you to know that historians in the last 20 years have revised this figure upwards. They used to give the death toll of the Civil War about 650,000. Now they estimate it's about 750,000 because they've added like the soldiers that died in prison and war camps and also from disease and everything. So just in terms of soldiers, the Civil War killed over 750,000. More people died in the Civil War than any other war in our history, even World War II. And there are other bloody conflicts in our history where people have killed each other or at each other's throats. But this question that you would think that's just so abstract, but yet that was the Civil War. And here's the whole point of going over this material. I think this question is actually still at the heart of our politics. And I'll come back to that on Wednesday when we go back to Wilson chapter 3 and sort of see contemporary versions of this. So it may seem like a boring issue, but in reality, it's actually almost all of our political issues in this country eventually kind of fall along this question of whether it's a state issue or a national issue. And you're going to see that's true of, and what I wanted to do at least was to look at the headline from the Wall Street Journal. So what's the big political issue? What was supposed to happen yesterday that didn't happen?
Yesterday?
Yeah. And by the way, you got it right. Why is October 1st? October 1st is called the beginning of the fiscal year. What's the fiscal year? What is it, the
Our
fiscal?
money.
Yeah, it's the financial year. Now, by the way, most businesses, there are 3 dates that actually begin fiscal years for countries and businesses. It wasn't January 1st, and that makes sense, doesn't it? It's the new year. But up until the 1974, most businesses and the United States government, most governments in the United States had July 1st as the beginning of their fiscal year. Now, you know what that means? It means, in other words, all the money that you spend in one year has to be budgeted or allocated before the end of the year, so that it's all arranged, right? And that literally, so when the fiscal year begins. Now, by the way, they moved it to October in 1974 because Congress, and you'll see why when we come back to Congress later on, Congress could never finish a coherent budget by the end of the year. They still have trouble with it. And that's what they're still arguing about. So you understand, all the money that we're supposed to spend the coming year is supposed to be already allocated by the budget. And as I think 3 of you understood, is that what's the debt limit?
Way too much.
Well, what is that? What is the debt limit?
What do you mean?
What is the concept? What is the concept of the debt limit? What does that mean?
It's the debt debt limit's like the ceiling that you hit, like when like you can't spend any more money, but the debt limit always just gets raised continuously.
And that's set for the fiscal year in the previous year. In other words, one of the last things Congress is supposed to do is to extend the authority to borrow money for the next fiscal year. And they couldn't agree on it. But they passed yesterday, and actually I think it was Wednesday they passed it, and President Biden signed it into law, an emergency extension so that the government wouldn't run out of money and go broke. Today, they extended it to December 3rd. So the government won't run out of money at least for another month and a half. What's the other two great controversial bills? When I said what was supposed to happen yesterday, had I read that article in the Wall Street Journal, it would have. What's the big controversy right now facing the country? The debt limit was one of them, but that's
COVID?
actually, huh?
I know.
She said COVID.
Because two bills are pending before Congress right now. The 1.5 trillion infrastructure bill that is bipartisan and was forged in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats, so it passed the Senate. But part of President Biden and Democrats, we'll explore this later on, is they want to expand the welfare state by adding certain kinds of entitlements like universal preschool and kindergarten, free college. By the way, AOC and the progressives wanted free college for everybody. They kind of pulled that back, and I think what the provision now is free junior college for everybody. So and paid leave in the so that has a price tag of $3.5 trillion. Although the Wall Street Journal argues the real price of that will be $5 trillion. And had I played an editorial, but I don't think we have time for this, in the Wall Street Journal, what did President Biden just say about this $3.5 trillion package last week? It became actually it became the basis of a lot of discussion. What did he say? You know what I'm talking about? He said it wouldn't cost anything.
He tries to say that about a lot of stuff.
Well, what he meant by that was that they hoped to raise enough revenue to cover all the new spending in the bill. Now add up 1.5 and 3.5, and what do you get?
6, 5.
5.
Sorry, I'm slow.
So by the way, we will talk a little bit about this later on, but can any of you explain the difference between the deficit and the debt?
The deficit is, wait, hold. The debt is how much we owe to other countries and
Total.
other people in total. The deficit is how much we, okay, so the debt's here. The deficit is like
What's
how
the
much you
deficit?
end up going past the debt, right? No? Like
I
the
think it's
debt
both
limit?
clearer and easier than that. How many of you have a credit card? How many of you have more than one credit card?
Heck no.
How many of you have ever bought a house?
Oh, Kaiser has. You don't know her.
By the way, actually, I didn't understand many of these issues, even though I'm a political scientist, until I bought a house in 2004, and then I learned a lot about it. Well, if you have a credit card, how many of you have a running balance on your credit card?
Wait, I don't know.
In other words, you all have credit cards, right? You have a credit card,
Yes.
Sabrina?
Yeah.
Do you have to pay it, or do your parents pay it?
My husband pays it.
Oh, bless your heart.
You know, bank.
So do you pay your credit card off every month? I'm not asking you, I realize this is personal, but I mean, you understand what?
Yeah, he pays it whenever he can. Like, it's not really set.
And what happens if you don't pay your credit card balance off in a month? What happens if you carry a balance from month to month?
Interest bills on it.
Yeah, what's interest?
Interest is money added to a balance when you don't pay.
Yeah, credit cards and banks loan you money, not out of the goodness of their heart. They make money doing it. How do they make money loaning you money?
By adding more money on top of it.
Yeah, they
when
charge
you're
you
late.
a price for it. And only they tend to distribute that price over the cost of the year, the annual percentage rate. So if you don't pay your credit, in other words, if you operate on a deficit, which means what? If you spend more than you got, then you take in. If you spend more than you take in, then you're operating on a deficit. Does that make sense? You're operating in the red. Now, by the way, most businesses operate on the red on one level, but what happens to a business if it constantly and it always operates in the red? What will happen to it?
Goes out of business.
Yeah, it goes out of business. There comes a point what you take in has to match what you spend, or or exceed it, by the way, and that's called a profit. You all understand that? So the deficit is the difference between how much money the government takes in any particular year and how much it spends. Now, since the 1970s, the United States has been running on a deficit. In the 1970s, it was so controversial because the deficit, the annual red ink was around $5 billion. By the 1980s, it had become $300 to $500 billion a year. By last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were spending about $1 trillion more a year than we were taking in. And that means we have to borrow like a credit card, right?
Who do we end up borrowing that money from, like other countries?
From other countries, from ourselves. It's part of it because the government pays for this by selling treasury bonds. I bought treasury bonds, so the government owes me money, so to speak. But my point is this. You know what a credit card is, and you know what interest is, right? If you have 4 credit cards and you don't pay them off, if the difference between the deficit and the debt is the deficit is what you're spending every month by not paying them off. But if you add it up, now for instance, I have 3 credit cards, which I pay off every month now. That's a big change in my life, and believe me, that made a big difference. Because I estimated that at one point, about 10 years ago, before I paid off my credit cards, I was paying $10,000 to $12,000 a year in just interest by having a credit card balance.
That makes me want to bother.
So you understand, that's like, I make $55,000 a year. If I was paying $12,000 in credit card interest, that means almost 1/5 of my salary is going to paying off credit cards, just to maintain a balance. So let me give you a piece of advice. I'm not a financial master, but if you can avoid it, do not accrue credit card balances. They are deadly for your financial life. Now my point is this, I also have a mortgage on my house. Now you know what a mortgage is, just a loan too, right?
No.
Well, in other words,
What it
I
is.
don't, my house is valued at $300,000. I don't have $300,000. I pay $1,000 a month of a mortgage. Does that make sense? Now, if you added up all the debt from my credit card and all the debt from my mortgage and everything else, I am in total debt of about, because my mortgage, my house is worth about $300,000 and I have about $50,000 in equity. So I owe money on my house. The debt is the total amount of accumulated unpaid money. Does anyone know what the accumulated debt of the United States is right now?
17 trillion. I don't know.
No.
About 30 trillion.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, look at that. I wasn't that far off.
No, you weren't. So the whole controversy that I wanted to connect what we're talking about today is what President Biden and the Democrats want to do is add not only another $1.5 trillion of debt from the infrastructure package, and then I'll get to the drama, the political drama in a minute. They want to add this a special expansion of the federal government of about $3.5 billion for social welfare programs. And so the controversy is what's the balance of the two parties in the Senate right now?
It's 50/50.
50-50. And if you know from Article 1, Section 5, to pass legislation, it takes a majority.
It takes 51.
So to pass something in the Senate, it takes 51. What happens when the Senate is tied?
When
like
it's
this?
tied, doesn't the vice president break
That's
the
correct.
tie?
And what the Democrats are hoping is you know what the partisan margin in the House is right now?
In the House, isn't it the Republicans? that
It's
vote?
212 Democrats, 208 Republicans.
Oh,
So how many votes can Nancy Pelosi lose before she can't pass the legislation she wants to pass?
and it's 4.
Yeah, she can only lose about 4 votes. It's one of the tightest margins in the House. So my point is this, if you look at the partisan balance in both the House and Senate, you can see it's basically 50-50, isn't it?
One more time, sorry. I got distracted.
I saw that. In other words, it's essentially 50-50 in both houses. And the problem is you know who the progressives and the moderates in the Democratic Party are? Who's the most famous Democratic moderate in the country today? You might have heard his name. He's the senator from West Virginia. Joe Manchin. There are 2 moderate Democrats in the Senate, Joe Manchin and Christian Sinema from Arizona. who have refused to support the $3.5 billion social welfare program. And the problem is in the House, the progressives with about 40, like people like AOC, et cetera, they said they wouldn't vote for the 1.5 trillion infrastructure program, which was supposed to come for a vote yesterday, until they passed 3.5 social welfare spending. Now the moderates in the Democratic Party want to pass the infrastructure bill, which has like roads and stuff like that. So what were they not able to do yesterday?
Pass that bill.
They couldn't pass it because Nancy Pelosi knew that she didn't have enough Democratic votes from the progressives, that they would have killed it. Because the progressives in the Democratic Party in the House have said they won't vote for the infrastructure road bill until the other bill is passed.
How can they say they won't vote though? Like, can they not get in trouble for that?
No, you can.
Well, you're gonna see when we turn to Congress, after break, you'll see that the party system works in such a way. Well, the Speaker of the House is a powerful office, but that doesn't mean that the Speaker controls everything in the political party. And you're gonna see there are big differences between the House and the Senate. But at any rate, I wanted to tie these issues to the question of federalism. And so you'll see that if and when you read the Wilson chapter, there are many contemporary issues of federalism which are still great controversy. And what I want to do is at least lay out the principal foundation for understanding it. So, if you're looking at the notes, here's how I want to lead you to this material. It's like a debate. First, we'll look at the goods of small local community, like to strengthen local government, state government, and Sentinel and Jefferson make that argument, as I've said. And then we'll look at the opposite side. For Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 11, we'll see that he makes the argument for a strong, powerful, wealthy national government. And then, as you're going to see, I'm going to argue the Constitution tries to have both. But if the Constitution tries to divide sovereignty between the national government and the states, the next logical question is, well, when should something be decided by the national government and when should it be decided by the states? And you're going to see that's where we still debate as a nation. And so on Monday, we'll look for when the national government should trump, not President Trump, but should have the main say. And McCulloch v. Maryland and the Second Lincoln Douglas debate, they suggest those circumstances in which the national government has to trump the states. And then the last set of readings, the two readings by Robert Putnam and William Schambra. I went to graduate school with Bill Schambra, but Robert Putnam is an interesting sociologist, and the two selections in the Nichols Reader are Bowling Alone, written by Robert Putnam, about the loss of local vital community. And by the way, where are you guys from? What state are you from, Sabrina?
South Carolina.
Where are you from, Sammy?
Tennessee, sadly.
Lexi?
Pennsylvania.
Where are you from?
Virginia.
Is your primary love, do you love America or do you love the state of Tennessee or South Carolina? Which is more important to you?
What if I loved neither?
Well, that's fine too. My point goes this though, how many of you would refuse a job in another state because you love living in your state so much?
No.
Not in Virginia, but in South Carolina. I lived in South Carolina.
So in other words, if you were offered a good job in Chicago, you wouldn't take it because you prefer to live. I understand you want to be close to your family or something.
Debatable, depending on
The job.
It depends on the job and like how it will improve, like take me further in my career if it will or if
I
it's
understand,
gonna-
everything is up to the
There's-
circumstances, right?
There's variables.
If they're gonna pay me
But I have
more.
to say that, say 50 years ago, especially in the South, because the South was the most locally oriented part of the country. When I came to teach at Congress College in 1986, the vast majority of students said they would not want to move to another state. Not because their families are here, but because they loved their state. I'm going to suggest that that's becoming weaker and weaker in American life. And that's exactly what, by the way, Putnam and Schomburg argue. They argue, by the way, for strengthening the states in our system of government. So you're going to see that that the question of where to find the balance between the national government and the states, that is still, in some ways, and you'll see my notes for Wednesday, that's almost at the bottom of every major controversy between healthcare, between abortion, between the pandemic, like those states, or immigration. I mean, I assume that you follow the news somewhat, you know what's happening at the southern border. But it's those border states that are actually protesting and acting against the federal government. Have you heard of sanctuary cities or sanctuary states? So in other words, even the issue of immigration divides up along this question of state versus national government. So that's the question we're looking at in this section. And so don't forget, the second midterm is next Friday, and it will cover the Constitution and this material that we're going over right now. Are we all on the same page?
Yes.
Good. So what's the argument for keeping government small and local? Sentinel, which is selection number 5 in Nichols Reader, it's on page 22. Let's take his argument apart, because he again, remember, he was an anti-federalist, which meant, what did he oppose?
The Constitution.
Because he thought that adopting the Constitution would eventually destroy the state and local governments, that all power would become absorbed into the national government. So, why does he think government should remain on a small local level? Yeah, go ahead.
Because he believes that the national government will overtake.
Well,
And
and
then
become
the power
tyrannical.
will become tyrannical.
And when you look at his article, it's actually, now remember, he's an anti-federalist, right? Say right.
Mhm.
Good. Thank you, Sabrina. James Madison, who wrote Federalist 10 and 51, who favored the Constitution and a very strong national government, if you remember from Federalist 10. It's interesting, they're on the opposite sides of the question of the Constitution, but they actually, Madison in Federalist 51 and Sentinel actually agree on a fundamental principle, that all governmental office holders, all people that hold power, have a tendency to become tyrannical. Now, what's Madison's solution in Federalist 51, if you remember? The concentration of all power in one set of hands, and what's his solution? Yeah.
His solution is either to get rid of human nature or like logically.
Which he doesn't think is possible
Yes.
or desirable.
Or logically to have so many minorities that there can no longer be a majority.
And that's in Federalist 10, but in Federalist 51, it's the separation of powers and checks and balances. In other words, what prevents one branch? All office holders want more power, right?
Yes.
So what prevents them from taking over is, in Federalist 51, is if you divide the government up between separation of powers and checks and balances. Does that make sense? Sentinel thinks, so the ironic thing is, even though he comes down on the other side of the question of the Constitution and favors small government, Sentinel agrees with Madison that all people that have political power want more. And the task is to how do you prevent people in power from screwing you? But his solution is not, as you'll see, separation of powers and checks and balances. His solution is, well, by the way, which do you think, what kind of government? A government where people elect their representatives, or one that has centralized power like a dictator or a hereditary monarch? Which government has the best opportunity to make sure that people in power are faithful to their public charge?
I feel like it would be like England's political, like how they do it. Because like with Parliament, like with the Queen and all that, I feel like that would be best bet, because people, when you're sitting in our government, looking at our government, people run to get elected, so they have that power to change it, but then the power ends up either going to their head or they're trying to get money.
So by the way, if the people really thought that the people they voted were screwing them over, what can they do?
Well, they could run themselves, but then they would just get power hungry as well.
Perhaps for the democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Sentinel just means this. If you have a Republican form of government, which is to mean you choose your leaders, because what happens if Queen Elizabeth became power hungry?
Well, she has Parliament. She has no technical
Well, that's
power
true. There's
because
limits
she
on
is
her
a figure.
power.
She is a figurehead.
But what about Xi Jinping in China or Putin in Russia? He controls their parliament. So there's no way to stop his power. In fact, in reality, Russia and China have actually become even more dictatorial in the last 20 years because there's no check on their power. So, and besides, Russian elections are rigged. So Sentinel's easy point is this: at least if you elect your representatives, a Republican form of government, if they become abusive, you can vote them out of office. Doesn't that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So then the question for him is, what kind of republic is better? A small republic or a huge national republic? Now, who makes the argument for a huge national republic?
Jefferson?
Madison.
Oh, my bad.
In Federalist 10. You remember that argument?
Jefferson's the farms.
This is just the opposite. Sentinel is making the argument for the small republic on the grounds that the people, and here's the problem, the people in a republic get to control the government, right? They can change it if they like, right?
Yes.
But as you're gonna see, and I think there's some evidence for this, he says the problem is the people just don't pay attention. They're so busy running their personal lives, they actually don't pay attention, and therefore it's easy to snooker them. If that's the case, now can you see why Sentinel would say it's better for government to remain small and local? And the reasons he provides are this. The issues on local life, like for instance, like what, schools or like roads. If your parents lived in the way of, if the county was about to build a road through their front yard, do you think your parents would take notice?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's affecting their daily life.
And it's something, they understand if they're gonna take 1/3 of your property away or your front yard, right? Or even when all these controversies over critical race theory in school boards, in fact, it's become an issue in the Virginia election. How many of you think parents should have some say in what public schools teach their children?
No.
No.
You don't?
I mean, yes and no, but then like you could have a parent who is like, you shouldn't teach history because it's scary, like, and then we repeat history and then we're just all screwed.
But you know, most school boards are elected by the people in the school district. So aren't they responsible to the parents of the children?
I mean, yeah, but, I mean,
Wait,
I guess that'd be
ask-
like our representatives now.
Let
Ask
me ask
the
you, who's
question
better to
again.
understand what your children should learn? Some national bureaucrat or you?
Well, that's debatable, if the, not
I wanna
national,
say
because you'd be
national
on the
because-
school, you'd be on the school board, so hopefully it'd be someone local, and in that sense, you would hope that that local person who's running for the school board would have some sort of idea of what education matters, like our education majors here, if they were to go
And that may
there.
be, but my point here is, don't your parents have some sense of who you are and what you should learn?
Yeah, but my parents can't speak for everyone.
No, but they can speak for you, can't they?
True.
And in some ways, you just made the argument, Sophia, that when it comes to determining school matters, is it better to have one national policy or at least local policy?
Local policy would be better,
Why?
because then it's more relevant to like the people in your community and not
That's
looking at
exactly
individual.
Sentinel's argument, that the government should remain small and local because it deals with issues that people understand on that level. When I first started teaching in 1986, how many of you ever heard of apartheid?
Apartheid.
Apartheid, you can pronounce it either way.
Yeah, I know exactly what
What
that is.
country did that involve?
South Africa.
What I found when students, they often had opinion on apartheid, but then I asked them, what's it about and what country is it? They often didn't know even what country, and I said, well, it's South Africa. And about, the only thing they knew was it was in Africa and it was in the south of Africa.
How is that the only thing they did? Oh, because they didn't learn about it.
That's correct.
I learned about it
Because
from a book. I didn't even learn about it in any classes.
my point here is, how many, do you think that people on the everyday life level know most about like missile systems in Russia, or the Belt and Road Project of the People's Republic of China, or the road going through their front yard or their kids in school? And that's why Sentinel says, if we have a strong national government, eventually all of government will be pulled away from local control into a national, and will become like a dictatorship. His argument is, if you keep government small and on the local level, people understand it, they participate in it, they understand it, and therefore it's easier for the people to control their own government. He also argues, by the way, against Madison in Federalism 51 for the separation of powers. You understand, if you have a separation of powers and checks and balances, it makes government more complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, and by the way, take the legislature. Is it easier for the people to follow what's happening in a unicameral legislature or a bicameral legislature?
No, unicameral, 10 out of 10, because bicameral has to go through, get passed by one house and then get
That's
passed by
exactly
another.
right. And Sentinel argues, when it comes to the structure of government, he actually says two things. Keep it simple, because the people are stupid, they don't pay attention, and therefore make it simple so they can pay attention. And therefore keep the structure of government simple, but his other main argument is keep it local. Because you understand that questions of national policy and international affairs are complex, people don't know much about them, but they do understand, some of them, their kids' education and the road through their front yard, right? So that's why he wants to keep government simple and especially local, so that the people can participate in it, understand it, and have genuine responsibility. All right, we'll stop here. We'll start with Jefferson on Monday. We'll finish this up on Monday. But then we'll turn to the question of where the balance of power is in the constitutional system. Thank you for reminding me to record the lecture. I would have forgotten otherwise.
Okay, does anyone need anything? I'm going out. I'm going to the bank counter.